Ma Ramostwe had a detective agency in Africa at the foot of Gale Hill. These were its assets: a tiny white van, 2 desks, 2 chairs, a telephone, and an old typewriter. Then there was a teapot in which Ma Ramostwe, the only lady private detective in Botswana, brewed redbush tea. And 3 mugs, one for herself, one for her secretary, and one for the client. What else does a detective agency really need? Detective agencies rely on human intuition and intelligence, both of which Ma Ramostwe had in abundance. No inventory would ever include those, of course. But there was also the view, which again could appear on no inventory. How could any such list describe what one saw when one looked out from Ma Ramostwe's door? To the front, an acacia tree, the thorn tree which dots the white edges of the Kalahari, the great white thorns, a warning, the olive gray leaves, by contrast so delicate. In its branches, in the late afternoon, or in the cool of the early morning, one might see a go-away bird, or hear it rather. And beyond the acacia, over the dusty road, the roofs of the town, under a cover of trees and scrub brush, on the horizon. In a blue shimmer of heat, the hills, like improbable, overgrown termite mounds. Everybody called her Ma Ramostwe, although if people had wanted to be formal, they would have addressed her as Me Ma Ramostwe. This is the right thing for a person of stature, but which she had never used of herself. So it was always Ma Ramostwe rather than Precious Ramostwe, a name which very few people employed. She was a good detective and a good woman in a good country, one might say. She loved her country, Botswana, which is a place of peace, and she loved Africa for all its trials. I am not ashamed to be called an African patriot, said Ma Ramostwe. I love all the people whom God made, but I especially know how to love the people who live in this place. They are my people, my brothers and sisters. It is my duty to help them, to solve the mysteries in their lives. This is what I am called to do. In idle moments, when there are no pressing matters to be dealt with, and when everybody seemed to be sleepy from the heat, she would sit under her acacia tree. It was a dusty place to sit, and the chickens would occasionally come and peck about her feet, but it was a place which seemed to encourage thought. It was here Ma Ramostwe would contemplate some of the issues which, in everyday life, may so easily be pushed to one side. Everything, thought Ma Ramostwe, has been something before. Here I am, the only lady private detective in the whole of Botswana, sitting in front of my detective agency. But only a few years ago, there was no detective agency. And before that, before there were even any buildings here, there was just the acacia trees, and the riverbed in the distance, and the Kalahari over there, so close. In those days, there was no Botswana even, just the Bechuland Protectorate. And before that, again, there was no Kama's country, and lions with the dry wind in their manes. But look at it now, a detective agency, right here in the Gaborone, with me, the fat lady detective, sitting outside and thinking these thoughts about how what is one thing today becomes quite another thing tomorrow. Ma Ramostwe set up the #1 ladies' detective agency with the proceeds of the sale of her father's cattle. He had owned a big herd and had no other children, so every single beast, all 180 of them, including the white Brahmin bulls whose grandparents had been bred himself, went to her. The cattle were moved from the cattle post back to Mochudi, where they waited in the dust under the eyes of chattering herd boys until the livestock agent came. They fetched a good price, as there had been heavy rains that year, and the cattle and the grass had been lush. Had it been the year before, when most of that southern part of Africa had been racked by drought, it would have been a different matter. People had dithered then, wanting to hold on to their cattle, as without your cattle you were naked. Others, feeling more desperate, sold because the rains had failed year after year, and they had seen the animals become thinner and thinner. Ma Ramostwe was pleased that her father's illness had prevented him from his making any decision, as now the price had gone up, and those who had held on were well rewarded. I want you to have your own business, he said to her on his deathbed. You'll get a good price for the cattle now. Sell them and buy a business, a butchery maybe, whatever you like. She held her father's hand and looked into the eyes of a man she loved beyond all others, her daddy, her wise daddy, whose lungs had been filled with dust in those mines, and who had scrimped and saved to make a good life for her. It was difficult to talk through her tears, but she managed to say, I'm going to set up a detective agency down in the Gaborone. It will be the best one in Botswana, the #1 agency. For a moment, her father's eyes opened wide, and it seemed as if he was struggling to speak. But he died before he could say anything more. And Maura Mostwe fell on the chest and wept for all the dignity, love, and suffering that died with him. She had a sign painted in bright colors, which was then set up just off the Lobast Road on the edge of town, pointing the small detective building she had purchased, the #1 ladies' detective agency for all confidential matters and inquiries, satisfaction guaranteed for all parties, under personal management. After a slow start, she was rather surprised to find that her services were in considerable demand. She was consulted about missing husbands, about the creditworthiness of potential business partners, and about suspect fraud by employees. In almost every case, she was able to come up with at least some information for the client. When she could not, she waived her fee, which meant that virtually nobody who consulted her was dissatisfied. People in Botswana liked to talk, she discovered, and the more attention of the fact that she was a private detective would let loose a positive outpouring of information on all sorts of subjects. It flattered people, she concluded, to be approached by a private detective, and this effectively loosened their tongues.